Arguably one of the most discussed topics in fantasy football every single year is how do you find players that maximize weeks 15 through 17, which are typically most people's fantasy football playoffs. And most people usually associate injuries and schedule along with that type of answer, but I just finished my longest research on any video to find exactly what makes the ultimate playoff dominator so we can get those guys for 2025. So just make sure to go down there, drop a like on this video, and subscribe to the channel to show your support. So I want to first give a shout out to Dante DeMora. He's one of the followers on my channel. He was really what kind of kicked me off into making this video right here when he asked me a question about finding players who are going to be really good for the actual season for you, but then also could be playoff dominators as well, so you don't make the playoffs and end up tailing off towards the end. He really inspired me to make this particular video right here. So essentially what I started out by doing, and you can see on the screen right here, was the first thing that I wanted to get was the player, exactly who it was, the year, the position, and weeks 15 through 17 fantasy points per game. Now, what this research went down to, the year it started at, was the year of 2020. So essentially I took 2020 to 2024, which is 5 total seasons worth of data right here. And I wanted to get the top 5 guys at the wide receiver position and the running back position from weeks 15 through week 17 in the fantasy football playoffs. And I wanted to take top 3 at the tight end position because top 3 and top 5 are definitely not the same from a running back and a tight end. They're just 2 totally different positions, and you see a fantasy points per game drop off once you get around that 5 spot for the tight end position. And I did not add quarterbacks to this research right here because I found what they are more predictable than a wide receiver, a running back. And what I essentially mean by that is guys who were top 5 quarterbacks all season long. Guys like Jaden Daniels, Lamar Jackson, Josh Allen. Those were all guys that essentially were the best quarterbacks to have during that particular time frame as well. So I ended up just not including them. I found more surprise guys at the wide receiver position. Guys like T. Higgins last year. I found more of them at the running back position. Guys like Tyjae Spears. You can see in a couple years ago, you saw guys like Sony Michel doing this type of business for you. That's what I was interested in figuring out. So I left quarterbacks out of here. Now, out of full transparency, I started off researching in the complete wrong direction. Like, what I initially thought was going to matter ended up not mattering here. So what I essentially started by doing, because I thought, again, that this was going to be what was going to lead me to my answer, was I started studying the opponents that they faced in those weeks 15 through 17. And what I wanted to know in particular was if there was a head coach or a defensive coordinator change, either preseason before that type of playoff explosion or during the season to the opponent's defense. So that was one of the first things that I wanted to know. I also wanted to know what the fantasy points were for that particular player versus the teams with no change to a defense or head coaching spot. Because essentially what I thought what I would see is that the majority of players who were playing coaches and playing defensive coordinators who had been there for years prior were going to do worse because there was more continuity and more stability within that opposing team's organization. Now, what we'll go through here in a little bit is not exactly going to support what that initial research was. And then I also wanted to see if there was a team quarterback change for the players who ended up finishing as top 5 players at their respective positions from weeks 15 through 17. Now, when I initially did this research, I actually was kind of believing I did find interesting data points on these head coaching and defensive coordinator changes. 80% results of research I do usually means a lot. But as you can see on the screen right here, it's really just kind of across the board, very similar for every single positional category. 52 out of 65 players played at least one team with a new defensive coordinator / head coach. That's 80% for the running back position. Then you go down to the wide receivers, it's basically the same, and it's basically the same for the tight end position. And you could go all the way down the list. Played at least 2 teams with that head coach defensive coordinator change. It's basically exactly the same. So that does not in any way, shape, or form indicate a major issue that I need to study further. And essentially, kind of what I always do with my research is anytime I get 80% results on something, that usually does mean a lot in the research, and I can usually dive into that a little bit deeper. But something just did not feel right because all of these positions essentially were adding up to the same exact percentage on every single one of these metrics right here. So I decided to look a little bit deeper into how many head coaching and defensive coordinator changes there were this particular offseason. So what I found essentially is that there's 12 teams with a new head coach or a defensive coordinator in 2025. So that's 37.5% of the total league out of 32 total teams right here. Now, that might not even sound like a lot to you. That might sound like a lot to you. I don't know how you will take it personally. But I do know after I show you what I'm about to show you, you can see how many teams alone play at least one team with a new head coach or defensive coordinator in 2025. You can just look at this list. Like, it is a ridiculous amount of running backs. Just one running back per team that play at least one opponent with a new head coach or a new defensive coordinator. 26 out of 32. That is the majority of the league right there. So that does nothing to narrow down any kind of research I had. And the last thing that I wanted to do before essentially abandoning this particular research pattern was organize these players by position group to see if any particular group was compounding a major percentage of these total numbers right here. So again, I split these players up by position instead of by year. And essentially what I found, again, was very similar across the board. 22 out of 25 running backs played at least one team with a new head coach, defensive coordinator. 88% of them. Wide receivers, at least one team, 80%. And tight ends, 80%. So again, the same exact type of results right here when I split it up by position here. Nothing stood out here. This really felt like a dead end, and I was kind of annoyed by this time of the research. Now, you might be asking yourself at this point, if this was so relevant, Ryan, why are you including this in this video? Do you really think that I would include this in the video for no reason at all? Of course, I wouldn't waste your time like that. It will come back in the end, so just make sure to stay tuned. So what I essentially wanted to do moving forward was I wanted to get a whole new idea on how to study this. So I went back to that comment that I got on one of my YouTube videos, and essentially what that whole thing was about was saying that good players on good teams just do not have the same level of upside late in the season that they did maybe in the first half of the season. So what I started doing was researching team records of these players when they were top 5 by position in weeks 15 through 17 since 2020. This is where we started to make some headway right here. So what you could see here is that we have a massive differential in percentages here. From players that were on teams with 4 wins or less, there was only 5 out of 65 of those total players that ended up being top 5 guys. That's 7.7% of these guys. And then you could even take it a step further, 7 wins or less. You had 3 wins on there, it's 24.6% of those players. That is where we start getting some really, really good headway. I'm a pattern recognizer, and I also prefer to research what I see in real football games versus the typical fantasy football analytics, like things like yards per route run, air yard share, all those types of different stats here that most analyzers and most creators are analyzing. I don't particularly like to do that. I like to go a little bit more off-roading, if you know what I mean. I do not like the typical research right here. You could see that anywhere. What we're seeing here is that 7.7% of these players over the last 5 years, last 5 seasons of fantasy football with 4 wins or less are inside the top 5. That is ridiculous number right there. 24.6% with 7 wins or less. And on the contrary, players on teams with 8 or more wins, 75% of those players were inside the top 25. 7 or more wins, 84.6%. There's our answer right there. We have our answer. You could see the complete difference in players on better to above average to great teams are significantly on there more than players on really, really bad teams in the NFL. So when you do research like this, you do want to be targeting the majority. You absolutely should be targeting the majority. But there's 2 things that I do want to walk you through essentially right here. Number 1, this does not mean that you should not target good players on bad teams. There's lots of those guys every year. Remember how many years the Buccaneers were bad and Mike Evans was still a fantasy stud? Yeah, those players exist. You should be targeting them. You can even just go to last year. Guys who made this list, Malik Neighbors, Brian Thomas Jr., Tyjae Spears were all top 5 players from weeks 15 through 17, and they were all on horrific teams. So I'm not saying in any way, shape, or form that you should stay away from these types of guys just because of their team fit. Even if they weren't week 15 through week 17 dominators, good players on bad teams will help your team throughout the duration of the fantasy season. And number 2, the second thing I want to tell you here is I am definitely known to try to thread the needle and find the outliers in a lot of situations. This is what I do every year now with my unsuspecting league-winning running back video. That is threading the needle right here. So essentially what I wanted to do, I wanted to split these groups up, and I wanted to look at the guys on teams with 7 wins or less in the last 5 seasons in fantasy football. And I found some really good stuff on there. So what you can see that full list of players right now. There's 16 total players from 2020 to 2024. And these, again, are the outliers of the outliers here. So take that what you will, but these were the outlier types of players right here. So the first thing that I noticed about this particular sample size right here was that half of these guys were running backs. 8 out of the 16 of these players were running backs, 3 were tight ends, and 5 were wide receivers. So anytime we get a majority here, I want to explore that even further. So what this should indicate to you is that if you target an outlier, a player on a bad team, for particularly week 15 through 17 optimization, running backs historically over the last 5 seasons have had a higher success rate. So maybe you should start out by taking a running back on a worse team and try to see how that works for you in the playoffs. This should not mean that you should necessarily avoid wide receivers, of course. Again, Brian Thomas Jr., Malik Neighbors would have really helped your team to have those guys in 2024. Maybe you want some money doing that type of thing. And again, what you see here is really interesting. 4 out of the 5 wide receivers who made this list had a late season quarterback change. That is very, very interesting right here. So you get guys like Malik Neighbors who had quarterback changes really from midseason on. Brian Thomas Jr. who had Mac Jones basically the last 5 games of his fantasy season. DJ Moore in 2022 when he was still with the Panthers. Sam Darnold started playing because Baker Mayfield couldn't cut it anymore. A lot of those types of changes happen to these bad teams in fantasy football. So if you do target an outlier, you should really target a wide receiver with potential for a mid-season quarterback switch. So let's just go through some underdog quarterbacks that are, towards the bottom of quarterbacks of your fantasy football draft. Teams like Indianapolis, New Orleans, the New York Giants, the Cleveland Browns, those teams do not exactly have the greatest quarterbacks in the league. They could easily see 2 to 3 more quarterbacks in 2025 beyond their starter in the 2025 season. So guys like Anthony Richardson could get replaced by Daniel Jones. And that you should be targeting Josh Downs, Michael Pittman Jr. for a potential late season spike with a new quarterback here. Guys like Chris Olave with the New Orleans Saints, Jerry Jeudy with the Cleveland Browns, and of course, the great Malik Neighbors should all be on your mind when it comes to this particular segment of the research right here. Because essentially what a new quarterback can do during the season is no matter how bad they really are in real life, they can provide a spark. I mean, we saw that with Mac Jones last year. Mac Jones is not a very good NFL quarterback, but he was still able to provide a enormous spark for your fantasy football team via Brian Thomas Jr. So these are types of moves during the season that can absolutely change the game for a wide receiver in fantasy football in weeks 15 through 17. Now, remember when I went through the opponent head coach and defensive coordinator changes in the first part of this video? So we're bringing it back to this because this is why I still included it in this overall research right here. 12 out of these 16 guys played at least one team with a new head coach / defensive coordinator. Head coaching and defensive coordinator change, I truly believe, can destabilize the defense year one in particular. Because if you come in with a new system, you're changing everything about the defensive scheme. As a defensive coordinator, you can lose some faith in a team really fast. And especially if you are not winning football games, that week 15 through 17 time frame, you can lose a lot of your players' trust in that defensive side of the locker room right here. So if you want to hear me talk more, particularly about head coaching, defensive coordinator changes, and how that affects defense in fantasy football, and the ones that you should particularly avoid because they're really good defensive coordinators, you should watch my recent defense ranking video. I go through it really, really deep on those defense rankings right there. So I wanted to move over now to our low win total candidates. And you'll see their weeks 15 through 17 opponents right here. So essentially what I did was I took teams with projected 6.5 wins or less, and I added them to this list right here. And you could see also green highlighters over the players with my particular favorite stretch of schedule, weeks 15 through 17. So every single position there, you see a total of 6 names. There's 6 total names on teams with 6.5 wins or less. And I'm also using Vegas Insider for the projected win totals right here. So it's not coming out of nowhere. So essentially what I wanted to do, just to kind of like streamline this particular part of the research, was I only included the top option for every team by position, or the player that I just prefer at each position for each particular team. But this essentially applies for the Las Vegas Raiders, the Carolina Panthers, the New Orleans Saints, the Tennessee Titans, the Jets, the Giants, and the Cleveland Browns right here. So those are 8 teams that this all applies to. And my favorite schedules in particular are the New York Jets and the New Orleans Saints. You can see that I highlighted Garrett Wilson, Chris Olave at the wide receiver position, Breece Hall, Alvin Kamara at the running back position, Mason Taylor, and Juwan Johnson at the tight end position right here. Now again, I don't love the New Orleans Saints at all. I really don't like their quarterback situation whatsoever. But weird things can happen weeks 15 through 17. And this type of data is suggesting that a New Orleans Saints player like a Chris Olave, who's being wildly discounted this year, might actually be a really good pick, especially in a best ball format right here. Juwan Johnson has also been a late season guy in particular past seasons, and I don't put it past him for doing it again just because of the quarterback situation, because he's fitting the criteria right here. They're playing teams that have changed at the head coach / defensive coordinator position. Same thing with the Jets right here. I think their schedules those last 3 weeks, the Jets are playing the Jags, the New Orleans Saints, the New England Patriots. I think that's a pretty favorable schedule outside of maybe New England. The Carolina Panthers, the Jets, and the Titans for the New Orleans Saints, I think is a very favorable schedule for the New Orleans Saints right here. So now let's go through and let's go ahead and target the majority here. I think it's time to target the majority. We spent a lot of time on the outliers. So what I did here was I went through players on teams that were projected for 7.5 or more wins on Vegas Insider. Again, I'm using Vegas Insider right here. And again, the list is much bigger than the outliers list right here. So it is the majority list right here. And obviously, it's important to note this. Not all of them are going to be top 5 weeks 15 through 17. Not all of them are even going to hit in fantasy football, but this is the result of the research right here, and that's ultimately why I kept the head coach and defensive coordinator changes and picked out the best schedules as part of the overall research right here. So you'll see the highlighted names here that I like. Pittsburgh, Miami, Minnesota, Tampa Bay, Arizona, and San Francisco have my favorite schedules weeks 15 through 17. So particularly with the Pittsburgh Steelers, Caleb Johnson is my preferred running back in the Pittsburgh backfield. I do prefer him as a fantasy option over Jaylen Warren. However, Jaylen Warren, number 1, is cheaper in fantasy football drafts right now. On Underdog, on Sleeper, anywhere you go to draft, he is much cheaper than Caleb Johnson, going several rounds behind Caleb Johnson. And also, Jaylen Warren did particularly fit my surprising league-winning running backs research to a freaking T. So I do actually believe that Jaylen Warren is a good pick in Underdog best ball drafts in particular to get this type of week 15 through 17 schedule for right here. So did Trey Benson. he also fit that unsuspecting league-winning running backs video. And actually, that is the back that I do prefer in Arizona. Not that I would leap up and draft Trey Benson in the spot of James Conner, but based on James Conner versus Trey Benson's price, yes, 100% I do prefer Trey Benson in underdog best ball drafts right now. And essentially what it would do is it would particularly fit the league-winning narrative if these guys were to hit on a week 15 through 17 and become a hero at the position and in fantasy football in total. At the wide receiver position, I've already discussed how much I like Jalen Waddle. I do prefer him over Tyreek Hill at this point. I think his schedule is also very favorable. Pittsburgh, Cincinnati, Tampa Bay are his last 3 teams that he plays. I think those are really, really good defenses to keep an eye on for late season woes and for Jalen Waddle to take advantage of. DK Metcalf for the Steelers, also in the same boat. Ricky Pearsall, another wide receiver I particularly like right now in fantasy football outside of this research, but especially with this late season schedule right here. Tennessee, Indianapolis, Chicago. Those are 3 defenses I think are potentially in the fritz. I like Chicago's roster a lot, but I do have concerns with the coaching changes and the overall philosophy changes over there. Those are good names to watch for as well. Tight end position, Jonnu Smith is another good flyer to take at the tight end position. Not as much of a flyer, he's definitely more expensive, but you want to take a flyer, Cade Otton. Cade Otton is in this group. He plays Atlanta, Carolina, and Miami the last 3 games. Absolutely could be this type of guy that you want to target for week 15 through week 17 optimization. Now, here's what I don't want you to take away from this video right here. I do not want you to take away from this video that you should blanket target good players on good teams. That will not always work for you. I also don't want you to take away from this video that you should avoid players on bad teams. There will be bad teams that have great fantasy studs like there always has been. It will happen again in 2025. Obviously, not all good teams will have all good fantasy football players, and there's going to be outliers on bad teams. But this video essentially is going to serve a couple different purposes. Number one, the idea that the best players on good teams descend in the playoffs in fantasy football is actually just a myth. And I'm particularly someone who likes to look a little bit deeper and maybe find if there's maybe some evidence behind the conspiracy. This is one that I do truly believe is more of a myth than anything else because it's backed up by numbers that we went through in the video. Number 2, while there are outliers on bad teams, they are outliers. That's the most important thing I could say. They should not be mistaken as the rule in fantasy football, and especially for weeks 15 through 17. And number 3, the most important thing that you should take away from this video, this is not a must draft list. This is not a do not draft list. This isn't even a league winning type of players video. It's none of the above. Someone like Chuba Hubbard, for example, was not exactly the most dominant player weeks 15 through 17 outside of 1 week, but he's someone I'd still consider to be a league-winning type of player based on the draft capital that you were able to acquire him at. So especially when you're talking about league winners, when you get involved in the draft capital conversation, that's a conversation that needs to be had when you're talking about league-winning players. But if you do want to target a player, specifically for weeks 15 through 17, you should target someone like a Jordan Mason, for example, on the Minnesota Vikings, a good team, over somebody like a Cam Scatterboot on the New York Giants, a projected bad team. So this took me the better part of a week to put together. I'm sorry if it was a little confusing, but let me know essentially what you think about the research down in the comments below and who you are preferring for weeks 15 through 17. And if you got value from it, just let me know. And if you do want to see that unsuspecting league-winning running backs video that is also highly important, click on this video right here.